The moment Grace felt that strong pressure against her thigh, the professional boundary in the studio didn't just break, it shattered. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, waiting for Charles to immediately withdraw his hand and apologize. He did neither. Charles held the contact for a long, deliberate second, his body close, his gaze intense. It was a test. Grace, terrified and completely euphoric, didn't pull away. His silence became his invitation. Years of neglect under Bruce's roof left her completely defenseless against this raw, focused attention. He finally moved, but his movements were no longer about posture. They were intimate, intentional caresses disguised as adjustments. He ran his hand down her side to align her core, and her skin immediately warmed beneath his palm. She realized he hadn't just noticed her body, he had recognized her hunger. Charles leaned in, his voice a low rumble close to her ear. "Relax your shoulder, Grace," he murmured. The mere use of her name, mixed with that husky tone, made her shiver. It was a more genuine intimacy than she had shared with her husband in months. She didn't just relax, she surrendered. The exercise ended, but the tension didn't. Charles helped her to her feet, his hands gripping her waist for a moment too long. She stared at him without apology, only pure, mutual desire. The Pilates studio, the supposed sanctuary of fitness, had become a sanctuary of their sin. Grace knew she had crossed a line, but the heady adrenaline already demanded a second class. Back in the sterile luxury of her room, Grace couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, with the scent of expensive linen and Bruce's neutral corporate cologne. It was the complete opposite of the studio, where she could still smell the soft, raw scent of Charles's sweat and the strong, clean scent of the yoga mat. She tossed and turned in bed, the crisp white sheets feeling like ice against her heated skin. Every muscle in her body, which Charles had just intensely exercised, now pulsed with a deeper, more intense ache. The memory of that firm, hard pressure against her thigh was a vicious cycle behind her eyelids. Grace pressed her palms against her temples, guilt trying to overcome the adrenaline. What had I done, she thought, but the question was immediately replaced by another. Why did this feel more real than my entire marriage? The lie felt more honest than the years of simulated partnership. Bruce rolled onto his side, his hand resting absently on her back. The touch was heavy, possessive, and utterly devoid of thought or intention. It was a casual claim of ownership. Grace recoiled inwardly. The mechanical nature of his touch only intensified the vivid, powerful memory of Charles's hands, attentive, deliberate, and filled with raw purpose. She got out of bed, unable to bear the closeness. Standing by the window, staring out at the city lights, she admitted the truth. She didn't regret the risk. She was consumed by desire for the next time, the next touch. The fire Charles had lit was a desperate need, and she knew she couldn't return to the cold silence of her fortress. If you're enjoying this and have already felt like Grace at her wedding, subscribe to the channel. Get ready because this is just the beginning of this true story. The next morning, Grace felt an intolerable impatience with the silence of her routine. At the breakfast table, Bruce was already engrossed in his tablet, occasionally muttering about an email. He was physically present, but his mind was continents away, a familiar toxic pattern that now felt like a physical assault. Grace asked him a simple question about a weekend plan, a soft attempt at connection. Bruce didn't even look up. He waved his hand dismissively and said, "Figure it out, Grace. Can't you see I'm working?" That casual dismissal, which she had endured for years, was now the final breaking point. Grace slammed her coffee cup onto the marble counter. The sound cracked the silence, forcing Bruce to look up, his face registering annoyance, not concern. "What is your problem?" he asked, his voice flat and controlled. "My problem," she shot back, her voice shaking with adrenaline, "is that I exist in this house and you treat me like a hired assistant." Bruce immediately shifted the blame. He didn't engage with her feelings. He adopted his usual, chillingly calm tone. "You're being dramatic again. I work to provide this life for you. Stop exaggerating everything." That word, exaggerating, was his weapon, designed to make her doubt her own sanity. Grace stared at his cold, judging eyes. There was no love, no empathy, just the towering ego of a man unwilling to be inconvenienced. In that moment of intense clarity, she felt the guilt of the morning vanish, replaced by a fierce, cold justification. She knew that her desperate search for touch with Charles was not a choice, but a survival mechanism. Just moments after the fight, Grace felt a cold, clear resolve. She didn't need to apologize to Bruce, and she didn't need his permission. She needed Charles. She grabbed her phone and sent a text, not to the studio number, but to the private number Charles had subtly given her weeks ago. "I need another session, not here, now." The reply was immediate, and it was everything she desperately needed. "The tension in your shoulders requires a private space. I know a place." The message, short and professional on the surface, was a mutual, silent declaration of war against her marriage. He was ready. Grace moved through her house, already transforming into a master liar. She dressed for a fake afternoon charity meeting, the kind Bruce would never question. When Bruce walked past, she offered him a practiced cold smile. "I'm heading out," she stated, making the transaction clear. He didn't ask where, he only nodded, confirming his total lack of interest. Driving away from her secure, suffocating fortress felt like breathing free air for the first time. The adrenaline rush wasn't guilt, it was the intoxicating thrill of secrecy. The life she was escaping was boring, but the one she was building was dangerous, exciting, and entirely her own. Charles's instructions led her to a quiet, anonymous boutique hotel across town, a setting miles away from the expensive, sterile world of her marriage. As she walked toward the entrance, she was no longer Bruce's neglected wife. She was Grace, the architect of her own desire. She felt alive, but she was about to learn that the consequences of this decision would be far more catastrophic than a simple divorce. The anonymous hotel room was the antithesis of Grace's home, small, temporary, and intensely focused on the present moment. When Charles opened the door, his professional mask was gone. His eyes held the same undiluted desire she had seen on the mat. There were no words, no games, only the intense, raw pull of mutual need. When Charles finally reached for her, his touch wasn't the tentative brush of a lover, it was firm and utterly purposeful. It was the exact opposite of Bruce's quick, distracted pats. Charles's hands explored her skin with a deep attention that acknowledged every contour, every curve. She felt seen in a way Bruce hadn't managed in years. The intimacy wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming herself. Every touch from Charles stripped away another layer of the emotional starvation that Bruce had inflicted. She clung to Charles, the years of feeling like an expensive accessory melting away under the force of his passion. The culmination was an overwhelming, violent wave of liberation. It was more than physical pleasure. It was the intense, absolute affirmation that she was desirable, valuable, and intensely real. Grace bit back a sob, realizing the emotional climax was the shock of feeling alive again. The silence afterward was heavy, not with guilt, but with the intoxicating recklessness of what they had just done. Charles held her, his breathing slow and steady. Grace lay there, a deep truth settling in her bones. She couldn't go back. The single choice born of desperation had immediately rewritten the rules of her entire life. Grace walked back into her penthouse, and the cold reality of her life hit her like a physical shock. The marble floors, the designer furniture, the vast echoing space, it all felt alien. She was a stranger in her own gilded cage, carrying the scent of another man's sweat and the heavy, intoxicating weight of her secret. The woman who left that morning was gone. A dangerous new version had returned. Bruce was exactly where she expected him to be, in his home office, bathed in the blue light of his monitors. He glanced up, barely, and simply asked if she had handled the dry cleaning. His complete lack of curiosity or concern, once normal, was now an insult. His indifference was the final, sickening proof that her affair was not a moral failure, but a desperate act of survival. She tried to resume the role of the devoted wife, but the facade was cracking. Her hands shook slightly as she poured a glass of wine. When Bruce joined her for a transactional dinner, he started criticizing her subtle weight gain from months ago, a narcissistic critique meant to maintain control. He spoke of her body as an investment that wasn't yielding returns. The memory of Charles's hands, attentive, affirming, praising her strength, exploded in her mind. Grace couldn't swallow Bruce's condescension anymore. She snapped, accusing him of seeing her only as a financial footnote. The argument immediately devolved from a civilized disagreement into a brutal character assassination brawl. Bruce, the controlled executive, didn't raise his voice. He used his words like surgical steel. He coldly detailed her financial dependence and the worthlessness of her society activities, weaponizing the luxury he provided. He left her shaken, but with a terrifying realization. He was not a partner. He was a powerful warden. Grace retreated, physically bruised by the words, but secretly energized. She was fighting a war on two fronts now, and she desperately needed to see Charles again, unaware that Bruce was about to notice the subtle scent of betrayal clinging to his expensive sheets. The weeks that followed settled into a dangerous electric rhythm. Grace perfected the art of the lie, creating complex, believable alibis involving fake charities and late-night meetings. She was driven by the intoxicating high of Charles's attention, which acted as the only antidote to the soul-crushing arguments with Bruce. Her double life was her oxygen. However, Bruce was a businessman, and his mind was wired to detect anomalies. His inattention began to shift into unsettling scrutiny. He started asking pointed, sudden questions about the details of her charity work, not because he cared, but because the gaps in her stories finally registered as a potential threat to his control. The first real seed of suspicion was planted by a sensory detail. One morning, Bruce noticed a faint, unfamiliar scent on the clean laundry, a subtle, earthy cologne that wasn't his. He didn't confront Grace. He simply held the towel to his face, his expression cold and calculating, committing the fragrance to memory. Later that week, during another hostile confrontation over her erratic behavior, Grace, exhausted and defensive, accused him directly of his infidelity, his secret nights with prostitutes. The accusation was meant to deflect, but it served only to enrage Bruce, whose eyes hardened with a terrifying narcissistic rage. He denied nothing, but he immediately reversed the focus. "Be careful, Grace," he said, his voice dangerously low. "When you start digging for dirt, you might find something that destroys your perfect image." It was a cold, direct threat that froze her blood. Grace realized she hadn't exposed him. She had merely told him she knew the rules of the game. She had awakened the beast. And she was about to discover that Bruce's corporate resources made him a terrifying opponent. The thinly veiled threat from Bruce left Grace reeling. She felt a chill of paranoia that Charles had warned her about. Her husband wasn't just emotionally abusive, he was systematically dangerous. She knew she had to accelerate her separation plans, but the fear of his power paralyzed her. Bruce's silence became his new weapon. He was distant, but his eyes were constantly tracking her movements, like a hawk circling its prey. Unbeknownst to Grace, Bruce hadn't just relied on suspicion, he had leveraged his vast corporate network. He discreetly tasked a low-level private security contact with observing her erratic errands. The first report came back swiftly. It wasn't definitive proof, but it confirmed Grace's frequent, unaccounted-for trips across town to a specific, unremarkable boutique hotel. The correlation between her sudden fitness kick and these trips was too neat for a mind like Bruce's to ignore. The scent of infidelity was now a dossier. During a dinner that felt less like a meal and more like an interrogation, Bruce leaned across the table. He didn't mention the hotel or Charles. Instead, he asked about her posture at the gym, using the word with a cold, mocking emphasis that sent a spike of pure terror through Grace's chest. "Your personal trainer is worth the trouble, darling," he murmured, his eyes holding hers in a stare of chilling, absolute knowledge. The casual mention of Charles's profession was the bombshell. Grace's heart exploded. She knew her secret was out, but the way he revealed it was designed to maximize her fear. Grace felt the walls closing in. She had underestimated the reach of Bruce's power, and she would soon realize that the only person she would truly target was the one she had confided in most, Charles.
Grace was utterly devastated by Bruce's chilling revelation. The shame of being caught was immediately dwarfed by the terrifying realization of being watched. She felt exposed, violated, and utterly trapped in her own home. She had to warn Charles, her only ally. Her first meeting with Charles after the confrontation was strained. She quickly relayed Bruce's threats and the likely surveillance. Charles, usually so confident and grounded, looked genuinely concerned. His professional license and career were now under threat due to Bruce's implied knowledge of their unethical start. The tension escalated when they noticed something unusual during their session. Charles was guiding Grace through a series of floor exercises when he suddenly froze, his eyes fixed on the doorway of the studio. A large, imposing man with an oddly familiar corporate demeanor was standing just outside, pretending to scroll his phone. Charles immediately recognized him as someone who worked for one of Bruce's security contractors. This wasn't paranoia. This was an active stalking effort. Charles immediately dropped his professional mask and ushered Grace into a back office, his face tight with controlled rage. "He's not just looking for proof, Grace," Charles hissed. "He's trying to intimidate us into silence. This isn't just about the divorce anymore. This is about control." The thrill of their affair was now replaced by the cold, metallic taste of danger. Grace realized the affair had given Bruce the perfect weapon: blackmail. She had found freedom in Charles's arms, but she was now dragging him down into the brutal, toxic war Bruce was determined to win. The fear for Charles's safety finally broke Grace's paralysis. She rushed to her lawyer, ready to file for divorce immediately, believing separation was the only way to end Bruce's surveillance. She was prepared for an ugly battle, but not for the financial guillotine Bruce was about to drop. Her lawyer looked grim. Bruce had moved first and fast. He had not only frozen all joint liquid assets, but had also filed an injunction claiming Grace was emotionally unstable, citing her sudden, frantic attempts to drain funds, which were actually her failed attempts to access money. He had used his power to legally immobilize her. He's using the affair as leverage against your stability, the lawyer explained, and he's making sure you can't afford to fight him. You are financially paralyzed, Grace. He's weaponized your dependency. The truth was devastating. She had been so focused on emotional freedom that she ignored her gilded cage's financial bars. The shame was overwhelming. Grace looked at the luxury watch on her wrist and realized it was worthless without Bruce's access. The years of comfort had been a subtle, calculated process of disempowerment. Bruce had ensured that leaving him meant not just starting over, but starting over with nothing. When she called Charles to explain the legal and financial lockdown, the conversation was strained. He was supportive, but the pressure was clearly affecting him. The passionate lover was rapidly becoming a stressed accomplice, realizing the true cost of their reckless choice. Grace hung up, realizing her personal savior was crumbling under Bruce's calculated corporate assault. She understood then that her greatest challenge wasn't Bruce's cruelty. It was the strength she had to find within herself to fight a power she couldn't afford to defeat.
The painful goodbye with Charles was not the clean break Grace desperately needed. It was just the start of a new kind of paranoia. Stripped of her lover's comfort and her husband's protection, she was utterly alone in her wealthy fortress. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just sad. It was ominous, amplifying every creak and shadow. Grace began to feel that the constant surveillance Bruce had initiated was not just emotional blackmail, but a physical threat. She started noticing subtle anomalies when driving, the same dark, unremarkable sedan parked down the street, or the repeated sight of the same man walking past her gym at odd times. The feeling of being watched transformed her elegant home into a cage with glass walls. She closed the automatic blinds early, stopped answering the door, and conducted every private call in the closet. The thrill of the affair was replaced by a constant, sickening anxiety, a fear that Bruce was waiting for her to make a final, fatal mistake. She received 2 calls late one evening, both from an unlisted number. She answered the second one, but there was only dead air on the line, just the sound of someone breathing slowly. The chilling anonymity of the caller immediately pointed her finger at Bruce's cold, vast resources, confirming the intimidation was escalating. Grace understood that Bruce didn't need to win the legal fight. He just needed to break her spirit through fear. He was using his corporate power to create a psychological environment where she was constantly looking over her shoulder. This isolation forced her to become ruthless. She knew she couldn't outspend Bruce, but she suddenly realized she might be able to outsmart him. The fight was leaving the courtroom and moving into the shadowy world of surveillance and secrets. Driven by the need to protect Charles from Bruce's relentless pressure, Grace devised a desperate last-ditch plan. She decided to publicly, yet anonymously, take the full blame for the affair. She hoped this act of surrender would pacify Bruce and remove the legal threat hanging over Charles's career. Using a borrowed computer in a public library, Grace typed a detailed, unsigned letter confessing to initiating and pursuing the relationship with her personal trainer. She fabricated details to make Charles seem like the reluctant, professional victim, positioning herself as the sole instigator. She sent the letter to Bruce's personal business email, knowing he would read it. For 2 days, she waited in agonizing anticipation, hoping the act of submission would at least alleviate the psychological warfare. Instead, Bruce's reaction was an immediate, furious counterattack. Bruce completely ignored the letter itself, seeing it only as a cheap attempt at emotional manipulation. The anonymous call returned that night, but this time the heavy breathing was followed by a single, icy word whispered before the line went dead: pathetic. Grace felt a crushing realization. Bruce didn't want surrender, he wanted destruction. Her attempt at protecting Charles only served to enrage her estranged husband further.
proving she was still trying to manage the situation rather than accept his absolute control. Grace crumpled the paper in her hand, the last vestige of her naivete gone. She realized she couldn't beg her way out of this war. She had to find a way to neutralize Bruce's power, and the only path was through his own dark secrets.
The failed attempt at surrender fueled a fierce new determination in Grace. She knew Bruce's arrogance was his greatest weakness, and she started hunting for the hidden flaw in his perfect corporate image. She remembered her lawyer mentioning Bruce's obsessive need for routine. Grace began tracking Bruce's movements, not with physical surveillance, but with the digital skills she had forced herself to learn. She checked public records, scrutinizing his business credit card statements obtained during the early legal discovery phase for anomalies that stood out from his usual high-end dining and travel. She found a recurring charge, a small monthly payment to a service provider in an entirely unremarkable part of the city, not associated with any of his official businesses. The charges were consistent, small enough to be missed by auditors, but frequent enough to be suspicious. Grace decided to break her self-imposed isolation. Disguised in non-designer clothes and dark sunglasses, she followed the trail of the recurring payment to a quiet, discreet street that housed a few small businesses and residential units. It felt like a world away from her glittering penthouse. She located the building associated with the payment. It wasn't an office or a gym. It was a nondescript residential condominium. Bruce, the man who demanded perfection and control, had a secret location, a hidden corner of his life that he had meticulously concealed. Grace felt a surge of terrifying excitement. She hadn't found proof of infidelity yet, but she had found the weakest link in Bruce's seemingly impenetrable fortress, his secret hideaway. Grace's pulse pounded as she stood across the street from the mysterious condominium. She returned 2 days later, armed with more courage and a small, discreet camera. She didn't want to confront Bruce. She needed irrefutable proof of his hypocrisy to use as a shield against his attacks. She waited for hours, observing the rear entrance away from the main street. Her patience was rewarded when Bruce's distinctive black sedan pulled into the private, unmarked underground garage entrance. He was clearly trying to keep his presence there completely secret. A few hours later, Bruce emerged. But he wasn't alone. He was briefly accompanied by a woman, clearly not a prostitute, but someone who looked like an employee or assistant, who gave him a small sealed envelope before disappearing back into the building. The interaction was quick and professional, but deeply clandestine. Grace managed to discreetly photograph the transaction, focusing on the woman, the envelope, and Bruce's slightly panicked expression. She later cross-referenced the woman and discovered she was a paralegal who worked for a small, nondescript legal service not associated with their divorce firm. Grace's heart sank with a new, horrifying realization. Bruce wasn't using the place for sexual escapades. He was using it as a clandestine office to manage assets, conceal money, or perhaps even plan his legal strategy, fully outside the required disclosures of their divorce. His secrets were financial and legal, not just personal. Grace looked at the photos, realizing she had found something far more dangerous than infidelity. She had found evidence of fraud, and that kind of leverage could bring down his entire corporate facade. The photos of Bruce's clandestine meeting became Grace's weapon. She didn't share them with her lawyer yet. She wanted to test the power of the information herself. The opportunity came during a mandatory settlement mediation hearing where the atmosphere was tense and frigid. Bruce, completely confident in his financial chokehold, adopted a tone of patronizing finality. He presented a low-ball settlement offer, framing it as an act of generosity, knowing Grace was too financially weak to refuse. He looked at her with smug contempt, expecting her to crumble. Grace remained perfectly calm. She excused herself to the restroom, retrieved a small, single printout of the most incriminating photo, the one showing Bruce taking the envelope from the paralegal outside his secret condo, and folded it neatly into her palm. Returning to the table, she waited for a moment when both lawyers were distracted. She then casually slid the photo, folded side up, across the table directly to Bruce. He unfolded it, glanced down, and his entire demeanor shattered. The color drained from his face, and his confident posture completely collapsed. He met Grace's eyes, and in her gaze he saw not revenge, but absolute knowledge. She didn't need to say a word. The image proved his deception and potential financial misconduct, which would instantly trigger an investigation into his assets and threaten his entire corporate empire. Bruce's carefully constructed world was suddenly teetering. He knew Grace held the nuclear option, and the balance of power in one terrifying second had flipped completely. The silent confrontation achieved what months of legal posturing could not. Bruce immediately terminated the mediation session, citing a sudden corporate emergency. His usual cold control was replaced by an almost palpable fear and desperation. He knew what the photo meant. Later that evening, Bruce called Grace, the first time he had contacted her directly outside of a fight in months. His tone was drastically altered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a strained, careful neutrality. He didn't threaten, he negotiated, implicitly acknowledging her newly acquired power. "Let's end this cleanly, Grace," he said. "No more instability claims, no more surveillance. I'll agree to a quick, clean settlement. You get a fair market value for your share of assets, and we both walk away quietly." He was offering a lifeline in exchange for her silence. Grace held the power. She didn't demand the house or the company, she simply agreed to the fair settlement, ensuring her financial stability without forcing Bruce into complete ruin. Her goal was never revenge, it was autonomy and silence. She had successfully used his own weapon, secrecy, against him. The emotional high of the affair had been replaced by the intellectual satisfaction of the win. Grace had outsmarted the man who believed her capable only of being an accessory. She had found her strength not in love, but in strategy. The final divorce papers were drawn up quickly and quietly. Grace was about to gain her freedom, but the true significance of her journey was about to be cemented in a final, powerful lesson. The divorce concluded swiftly and quietly, exactly as Grace had dictated. She signed the papers, securing her financial independence and, more importantly, her right to anonymity. Bruce was gone from her life, his empire intact, but his control over her was forever broken. Grace walked away with a peaceful sense of finality. She wasn't bitter about the loss of luxury. She was proud of the unyielding strength she had found in the face of absolute intimidation. She quickly moved into her new life, continuing her education and focusing on building a career rooted entirely in her own effort. Years later, reflecting on the whole saga, the agonizing emptiness, the passionate recklessness with Charles, and the brutal war with Bruce, she realized the profound lesson. The affair was wrong, but it was the necessary shock wave that forced her to confront her own dependency. The greatest risk she ever took wasn't in betraying her husband. It was in allowing herself to be invisible for so long. She learned that a truly empty life is the greatest betrayal of all. And sometimes, to find your worth, you have to risk everything. The most valuable lesson wasn't about Bruce's cruelty or Charles's passion. It was about the ferocious strength you discover when you have nothing left to lose. This story is far from over. If you felt every moment of Grace's passion, her fear, and her ultimate liberation, then you won't want to miss our next deep dive into real-life secrets. Hit that subscribe button right now to join our community and keep the revelations coming.